The hidden case files. The ghost in the system. If you think justice sleeps forever, think again. Because when it wakes, it remembers every scream. Don't forget to subscribe before we dive into a story buried deep in California shadows, a story the police thought they'd closed decades ago. But evil, it seems, doesn't retire. It hides in plain sight. It was a spring morning in Sacramento, 1978. The sun was barely up when Detective Frank Milner stepped onto the driveway of a modest suburban home, a house that would soon define his entire career. Police tape fluttered in the breeze. A woman's body lay motionless on the floor inside, her husband slumped nearby, both killed brutally, almost ritualistically. There were no witnesses. No signs of forced entry. Only a few footprints in the dew-covered grass, leading nowhere. Neighbors whispered about a prowler, a shadow they'd seen peering through windows for months. Someone who moved like a ghost, who studied his victims long before striking. The newspapers called him the East Area Rapist. But what started as home invasions and assaults was about to evolve into something far deadlier. Frank had worked homicides before, but this case was different. There was precision in the chaos, every scene meticulously planned. The intruder tied up husbands, tormented wives, and vanished into the night without leaving a single trace. He took small tokens, rings, photos, even a single earring. To Frank, it felt like trophies. But to the victims, it was as if the man had stolen a piece of their soul. By the early 80s, the attacks spread beyond Sacramento. Modesto, Contra Costa, each crime bore the same eerie signature, bindings, a whispering voice, and an aftermath of silence so total it chilled even the most hardened detectives. When murders began appearing further south, local police thought they were chasing a copycat. They weren't. It was the same man, perfecting his method. Frank's investigation grew into obsession. He built boards covered in photos, maps, and handwritten notes. Every red string pointed to nowhere. The killer's pattern defied logic. "He knows us," Frank muttered late one night, staring at the board. "He's learning our response times, our procedures." Some colleagues laughed, said he was chasing a phantom. But deep down, Frank knew this wasn't random. This was personal. Years turned into decades. The killings stopped as suddenly as they'd started. The world moved on, detectives retired, and the case files gathered dust. But Frank couldn't let go. He'd see those crime scene photos in his dreams, the same rope, the same knots, the same untraceable footprints. The killer had become folklore, whispered about in police academies as the Golden State Killer, a name that carried both legend and shame. Then, in 2018, long after Frank had left the force, a young genetic genealogist named Ellen Ruiz reopened one of those forgotten boxes. She wasn't a detective, but she had something new: DNA. Using public genealogy databases, she built a family tree out of fragments left behind on a crime scene swab taken 40 years earlier. It was slow, painstaking work, but one night the system pinged. A partial match. A relative. A single leaf in a massive family tree. Ellen traced the branches, cousins, uncles, distant relatives, until the pattern led to one man, Joseph James DeAngelo, a retired police officer living quietly in a Sacramento suburb. A man in his 70s with a clean record, a trimmed lawn, and neighbors who described him as private but polite. The discovery was so unbelievable that the cold case unit almost dismissed it. "A cop?" one detective whispered. "You're telling me the monster we hunted for decades was one of us?" Ellen's hands shook as she slid the file across the table. "The DNA doesn't lie," she said softly. The task force moved carefully. Weeks of surveillance followed. They watched DeAngelo shop for groceries, tinker in his garage, and walk his dog down quiet streets. Every move seemed ordinary, until a discarded tissue confirmed the match. The same DNA from those forgotten crime scenes. 40 years of unanswered questions. 40 years of ghosts. And now, finally, a name. But when they raided his home, what they found inside wasn't just evidence. It was a museum of nightmares, souvenirs from victims no one even knew existed. They thought they were arresting an old man. What they didn't know was that they were about to meet the ghost that haunted California for half a century. If you're still here, hit that subscribe button, because this chapter takes us deep inside the mind of the Golden State Killer. And what investigators discovered next would haunt even the ones trained not to feel. April 24, 2018. Sacramento police cruisers surrounded a quiet suburban home on Canyon Oak Drive. The neighborhood was calm, the kind of place where mailboxes overflowed with flyers and kids played catch in the street. But this morning, the silence broke. Go! 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 Officers moved in, guns drawn. The old man looked up from his garage, startled but not afraid. His eyes, pale, unblinking, met theirs with eerie calm. "What's this about?" he asked, voice steady, almost amused. When they cuffed him, he didn't resist. He just muttered, "I've got a roast in the oven." That man was Joseph James DeAngelo, 72 years old. Former Navy man. Former cop. Former husband. And as detectives would soon learn, former monster. Inside the house, the air felt heavy, like stepping into a crypt. The living room was ordinary, neat to the point of obsession. But the deeper they searched, the more disturbing it became. Hidden drawers. Labeled boxes. In one corner, an old tackle box filled with jewelry, mismatched earrings, wedding rings, small gold chains. The same trophies taken from victims between 1976 and 1986. Detective Milner, now retired, brought back as a consultant, stood frozen in the doorway. "He kept everything," he whispered. "Every single one." On a desk sat a stack of yellowed maps. Each marked with red pins, crime scenes stretching across California. When investigators spread them out, the pattern became clear. DeAngelo had mapped his entire career of terror. He had kept his memories organized, methodical, and intact. He'd lived among his ghosts for decades. The interrogation room was dim, its air stale with anticipation. DeAngelo sat motionless, shackled to the table, staring at the wall. Detectives tried to break him with photos, dates, and the names of his victims. He didn't flinch. For hours, he said nothing, until one investigator read out a name, Deborah Manning. DeAngelo's jaw tightened. A long silence followed. Then, barely above a whisper, he said, "I didn't want to do all those things, it was Jerry." "Jerry?" the detective asked. "He's the one inside me," DeAngelo murmured. "He made me do it." The room fell silent. For a moment, even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to fade. The man who had once enforced the law was blaming his crimes on an alter ego. A voice, a presence, something he claimed had followed him since childhood. Some called it manipulation. Others saw genuine fracture. Either way, it was clear. DeAngelo had spent a lifetime hiding behind masks. The officer. The husband. The father. The predator. Outside the station, news vans flooded the street. Reporters shouted questions. Headlines screamed across the nation, "Golden State Killer captured after 40 years." Survivors wept. Families of the murdered gathered in stunned silence. For them, this was more than closure, it was resurrection. The past had come back, demanding to be heard. But behind the relief, darker truths emerged. Detectives realized DeAngelo hadn't stopped killing because of guilt. He'd simply aged out. The adrenaline, the control, it no longer gave him what it once did. His crimes had been a ritual, an addiction fed by fear and dominance. When his body weakened, his rage didn't vanish. It just went dormant. And that's what terrified Frank Milner most. If a man like this could hide for decades, living among neighbors and children, mowing his lawn while families mourned his victims, how many more were out there, still unseen? Late that night, as officers processed the evidence, one of them opened a sealed envelope found in a box beneath DeAngelo's bed. Inside was a single Polaroid photograph. A young woman tied to a chair, eyes wide with terror. The image was dated 1979. But there was no record of her in any known case file. Milner stared at the photo, his stomach turning. "Who is she?" he asked. No one answered. The room was silent except for the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights. And then Ellen Ruiz, the genealogist who'd helped find DeAngelo, said quietly, "That's not one of his known victims." Which means... She looked up pale. "We've only scratched the surface." When detectives cross-referenced DeAngelo's travel records, they found gaps, months at a time where his whereabouts were unknown. Records showed that during those missing months, several unsolved murders had occurred across Nevada and Oregon. The same bindings. The same twisted calling card. The monster they thought they'd caged might have left a trail far longer and darker than anyone dared imagine. And when they checked the last page of his hidden notebook, they found a single line written in trembling ink. "I'm still watching." If you've come this far, you already know monsters don't live under beds. They mow lawns, wave at neighbors, and wear badges. This is the final chapter of the Hidden Case Files. Subscribe if you dare, because what you're about to hear changes everything we thought we knew about the Golden State Killer. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with faces carrying decades of pain. Some were gray-haired now, others shaking as they held photos of the loved ones they'd lost. And there, shackled in an orange jumpsuit, sat Joseph James DeAngelo, the man who had once walked among them unnoticed. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the judge. His eyes were hollow, the same eyes that had watched countless victims beg for mercy. For months, prosecutors had pieced together a case that spanned generations. The DNA trail was airtight. The evidence from his home, the trophies, the maps, the notes, told stories too gruesome for court. Yet when it came time to speak, DeAngelo didn't deny a thing. "I did all that," he said softly. The courtroom froze. Reporters leaned forward. His voice was cracked but steady. "I destroyed lives. I lived with it. I was good at hiding." Detective Frank Milner sat in the back, his heart hammering. 40 years he'd chased this man, haunted by questions. But now, hearing the killer's voice, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like standing in front of a grave too deep to ever fill. Then came the twist no one expected. During a recess, DeAngelo's attorney handed the prosecution a sealed folder, something DeAngelo wanted entered into the record. Inside was a confession letter he had written months before his arrest. It wasn't addressed to the police or to the victims. It was addressed to himself. The letter read like a diary, filled with cryptic references. The voices started on patrol. The quiet nights made them louder. "Jerry wants control. He doesn't stop when I tell him to." And one line, circled in red ink, "The job taught me how to hunt, and no one ever checked the hunter." For the investigators, it was a chilling admission. The man sworn to protect the public had used the system, his own badge, to outsmart it. He'd studied police response times, learned evidence procedures, even manipulated early crime databases to erase his trail. Every step he took had been deliberate, calculated, professional. As the trial continued, victims' families took turns addressing the man who'd destroyed their lives. Some cried, some yelled. But DeAngelo sat motionless, eyes lowered, as if he'd already left this world behind. Then, during the final victim impact statement, something unexpected happened. A woman named Carol stood up. She had been one of his earliest survivors, one of the few who had lived to tell the story. Her voice trembled, but her words cut through the courtroom like a blade. "You broke into my home and told me to be quiet," she said. "You said no one would ever believe me. But look around, Joe. We all believe now." For the first time, DeAngelo looked up. His lips quivered, not in remorse but in something else. Fear. And that's when the whispers began. Detectives from other states started reaching out. Cold case units from Oregon, Nevada, and even Washington believed DeAngelo might be tied to unsolved crimes in their regions, attacks that matched his precise methods. The deeper they dug, the longer the shadow grew. When authorities opened a locked box found inside DeAngelo's storage unit weeks later, they uncovered more than evidence. Inside were dozens of old cassette tapes, each labeled with a name, a date, and a single word, visit. The FBI began the slow process of restoring the tapes. Some were too damaged, but others contained faint audio, heavy breathing, muffled sobs, and DeAngelo's calm voice giving orders. It was confirmation of what many feared. He'd recorded his crimes. Every sound, every plea. The revelation broke even the most seasoned investigators. Some of them had worked this case since the 1970s, and now they realized the full scope was far worse than anyone imagined. During sentencing, Judge Michael Bowman spoke the words that echoed through the courtroom and across history. Mr. DeAngelo, you lived a normal life surrounded by people who had no idea what you truly were. You believed time would protect you. But time doesn't forgive. And neither will this court. DeAngelo received multiple life sentences without parole. No chance of freedom. No chance to vanish again into suburbia. But even as he was led away, Detective Milner couldn't shake a single thought. The notebooks. The missing months. The names on those tapes that didn't match any known victims. Later that night, back in his car outside the courthouse, Milner opened one of the photos recovered from DeAngelo's house, the same unknown woman from the Polaroid found weeks before. He flipped it over. Written on the back, in faded ink, was a date from 1981, and a town in Oregon no one had ever connected to the Golden State Killer. Milner closed his eyes, the weight of unfinished justice pressing down once again. Maybe the monster was gone. But his shadow wasn't. And as Ellen Ruiz uploaded another set of genetic data into the national database, one more match notification appeared on her screen, a partial hit tied to a case older than DeAngelo's first known crime. Her breath caught. "Frank," she whispered into her phone, "you need to see this." Because sometimes, when one ghost is caught, another rises to take its place. If you thought the story was over, it's only the beginning. Subscribe, because the next case is darker than you can imagine. End of story. The Hidden Case Files.